Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Hobby Tips. So this week we're going to be looking at palettes, wet palettes, dry palettes, bits of paper, basically all the stuff that you paint on, or mix the colors on. And there's a lot to choose from, and it's hard to sometimes know which one is best and all that sort of thing. So I'm going to give you my 2 cents on what I think works, doesn't work. I've been in this hobby for a very long time, and I've used everything, and I've now used wet palettes, as you can see in front of me, this Army Painter one. And so I have a few ideas on that and what I think does and doesn't work. So let's get into it. If you're starting out and you're just getting into the hobby, then there's probably a few things you can do. Now, you've probably seen everyone using wet palettes. Oh my god, they're so great, all this kind of thing. Now, they are good, but they come with their downsides. Part of when you're first learning to paint is you're trying to control the paint, water things down, control the dilution, all of those type of things, and that's going to be very difficult to do on a wet palette, and there's a few reasons for that. But before we go through, let's just look at the different types. So we have your bit of paper. Now, what's the paper for? Well, you're going to use that for dry brushing. So, or a bit of tissue or paper towel or something like that, and you'll use that for dry brushing. So you'll rub the brush. You'll have your big brush, and you'll be rubbing it on the surface here to get it dry so that you can do your dry brushing. You're going to use that no matter which end of the spectrum you end up choosing in terms of your palette, but a piece of paper or something like that handy is always good, so I'd recommend that. So that's the first one, and that doesn't cost you anything. That's cheap. You just go to your newsagent wherever you go, pick up some paper, and away you go. Now, the next things is we've got our dry palette. Now, as you can see, very, very highly advanced palette here. This is just a plastic lid, which is great to use. And then we have a little bit of foam core here, a bit of cut off here, and you can see I've used a lot of paint on this. It's built up. And these are great. So what are the advantages of using dry palettes? Well, one of the things that's really good with this is that you can learn to control your paint much better. Yes, it's going to dry out faster, but it's going to allow you to really, really control how much water to paint you need. And that's something that's really important when you're first starting. Less so when you're experienced, but certainly I would recommend when you first start out just to get a dry palette, just use something like this and practice mixing your paints and doing all that to start with. And that will teach you the process. And even now, I don't only use a wet palette. I also use a dry palette for different types of things. Another great advantage of having a dry palette is that you can keep it like this, and it becomes like a little timestamp of the colors you used on a certain model. So if you're like me and very lazy and don't want to be writing PDFs, stories about your recipes and what you've done over every single army you ever do, because that's just way too much work. If you happen to be very motivated and you like to do that, then great. But if you're like me and you're not doing that, then this is a great thing just to take a look at this and you go, oh, that's right, I was using that color and I was mixing them together. I know how to go ahead and do this model that I haven't painted in 6 months. And so I like to keep these around, and then I use them as a little bit of a springboard to remember what I was doing at the time I was painting that model. So that's one of the advantages. And then also for things like terrain, using PVA glue here, wood glue, to do terrain and stuff, I use these dry palettes all the time for that sort of thing. That's definitely a winner there. So you're definitely going to use it, and it's extremely cheap. Now the next part is the wet palettes. Now the wet palettes, they're really cool because they're going to lengthen the time that you can paint with the paint that you've mixed on the palette, because the water inside the palette is going to help keep it wet, and that's great. But when you start out, you might want to put all your money in one basket and buy one of these things. This isn't a particularly expensive one, but they can be expensive, and when you're starting out and you don't really know what you're doing, do you really want to spend that money? Well, the answer is probably no. And so when you begin, what you can do is you can get a lid like this that has a bit of depth to it, and you get like a either a sponge, like a cleaning sponge, that's flat, or a little bit of thickness, probably about the thickness of this, and you put that sponge into here. You wet it, and then you're going to use basically baking paper, and you're going to cut a piece out and put it on top. Usually it's baking paper or something similar to that. It's a porous kind of paper that you use in the kitchen, and you'll cut a piece out and you'll put it on top. Now, that's great when you're first learning, because you can now have a go at a wet palette. And so what happens is you fill the bottom with water, and the sponge soaks up the water, the baking paper is on top, and then you're going to apply your paint to that. And we're going to see that in a minute in a more advanced version here, but I'm just giving you the idea. And so that's something that's very, very quick and easy to do, and you can have a go at using a wet palette. Now, the advantage of that, it's super cheap. It's going to cost you a couple of dollars to sort that out, but the problem with using cloths or sponges that are designed for a kitchen is that they're actually really good at absorbing water. And so when you put that little bit of water in there, that little mill of water in the bottom, and you've got your sponge in there, it draws all that up. And where is that going to go? Well, it's going to be then drawing up into the baking paper that's on top and into your paints. And that means that the work time that you've got for your paints while you're painting is actually quite short. It's going to suck up all of that water and really, really make your paints turn into ink washes. And so you're losing that dilution. And one of the problems with that is that if you're not experienced, you're going to not know how to control that. And so it becomes a bit of a problem. So if I were you, I would stick to dry palettes if you're new. And what you really should do is, unless you're experienced, use one of these, but I would just save up and go directly into a specially made palette. And the reason for that is that the sponges that you're using in this and the paper you're using is designed for this. It also has an antibacterial agent in the sponges to help stop mold and other things forming in your palette, which is really good as well. So I would probably skip this step unless you're experienced, and go straight to a bought one, because these are designed. The other advantage is they come with pre-cut pieces of paper that you don't have to cut every time you're doing it, which saves you time and makes it faster. So this type of approach, I think, is way more efficient than doing the makeshift wet palette. So let's take a look at it and see what it's all about. So this is from Army Painter, and if we take this off and open it up, we'll see exactly what the go is. So in the top, this one comes with like a little area for brushes. I never use that, but you could if you wanted to. And then you open it up, you can see the moisture on the underside there, and we have the wet palette. And so here we've got a sponge underneath. So if we lift this up, we can see we've got the paper here, which is this thin sort of baking paper like stuff, and then we have the sponge, and the sponge is designed to absorb that water and control it. But on one of these, what I've noticed is that the absorption of water into the paint is much slower, so you have more work time. You can see now just on this side here, it's starting to break down. You can see the paint mixing. You can reconstitute it a bit, but it is quite thin, so you're probably going to have to redo it and restart it somewhere else. What I've found is you can actually modulate the amount of water and get a better result. And so you put maybe a bit less water in and have the sponge be just damp with this paper on top, and you can actually get a sort of in between a dry palette and a wet palette, and that will allow you to control consistencies in the paint, and I think that's very important. So definitely. And obviously the biggest benefit is that they come with these pre-cut pieces of paper, and that's I'd rather pay money for that than have to sit there and cut bits of paper every time. I tried that when I tried one of those makeshift versions of wet palette, and that just sucks. So don't do that. Just get rid of that and get on to just doing this. I mean, if you're going to spend $1,000 on models every year on, in the hobby, or whatever, 3D printing or whatever type of models that you're doing and building, why not spend $40 on something like this? And that's the price of this, at least in Australian dollars. I think it's around $40 or $35. So something like that is, and this is a good size. Well, you got to pay into consideration the size of the palette. This is decent to start with. You can get larger ones, and in fact probably in the end, if you really love using wet palettes and you use that predominantly, then I would actually go for a brand that's a little bit bigger, so you've got more room to do a lot of work on. As you can see, it spreads out, and you can't really use that spot anymore. So for real estate, for surface area, I'd probably go for a larger one. If you're going to be using predominantly wet palettes, you really love that, then I would do do that, but I tend to go between, you know, the dry pallets and the wet, so I don't need it quite as big. This is perfectly fine for my applications. But yeah, that's my 2 cents on it. I have enjoyed using this Army Painter one. I think it's pretty good. So if you are looking for one, I would suggest starting with one of these. I think these are designed for that sort of intermediate level, and I think that's great. And it's relatively cheap. I mean, if it's $35 odd in Australian dollars, it's probably quite cheap. If it's in pounds or American dollars, you can pick one up quite easy. And the paint lasts for quite a while. It'll sit in there for quite some time without breaking down too much, and you can reconstitute it. And as I said, if you want to modulate it, you can add less water in, and that will help give you a drier palette, which is easier to work with. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed my 2 cents on that. It is a difficult sort of thing to decide on what you're going to choose, and you don't want to waste money and all that kind of thing. But I think what I've presented here today is probably a good starting point for you to think about when you're getting into the hobby, or if you're into that intermediate level, or like me, coming back to the hobby after years away and seeing how different everything is, and wet palettes and all this kind of stuff. Back in the day, we never had any of that, so it is a new world, and I guess my experience is coming from fresh eyes, and so this is the sort of, I guess, thoughts that I've found about that. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and please subscribe and, you know, hit that notification button if you've liked what I've just shown you, and otherwise have a great day, and I'll catch you on the next one.